The fog rolled thick and low over Lake Barlow. Eleanor Westbrook gazed out the window of her small, cozy house. She lived on the outskirts of town. The lake, still and almost eerie, was a constant companion throughout her life. It held memories of her childhood and her grandfather's countless stories. But there was something unsettling about it now, something that had been bothering her for years. The lighthouse, once a beacon of safety for ships navigating the dangerous waters of the lake, stood tall at the farthest point of the shore. Over the years, it had fallen into disrepair, its lights extinguished, and the town's attention shifted elsewhere. But Eleanor couldn't forget. Her grandfather, Arthur Westbrook, had been the town's beloved marine historian for as long as she could remember. He had dedicated his life to uncovering the mysteries of Lake Barlow. Every summer, she would visit him at his home on the lake, and he would tell her fascinating stories about the lighthouse, tales about its purpose, its history, and the dark secrets buried deep in the lake. But in his later years, Arthur had become obsessed with one story above all: the story of the lighthouse keeper who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. It was said that Elias Thorne, the last keeper of the lighthouse, had stumbled upon something powerful, something buried deep beneath the lake. Some claimed Elias had gone mad before his disappearance. Others said the light had driven him to a tragic end. Before Arthur passed away 5 years ago, he had often said to Eleanor, "The light still burns, but only for those brave enough to reignite it." She had never quite understood the meaning of his words, but they had always haunted her, lingering in the back of her mind. Now, with her grandfather gone and the lighthouse left to crumble in silence, Eleanor found herself drawn back to the mystery he had left unfinished. She needed to know the truth. It wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about honoring her grandfather's legacy, a man who had spent his life uncovering the secrets of the lake. It was time to finish what he had started. At 67, Eleanor wasn't as young as she used to be, but she still had the fire of curiosity that had always driven her. She gathered her grandfather's journal, old maps, and a flashlight. It was time it wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about honoring her grandfather's legacy, a man who had spent his life uncovering the secrets of the lake. It was time to finish what he had started. At 67, Eleanor wasn't as young as she finished the journey he had started. She made the decision that morning. It wasn't something she could delay any longer. Without a second thought, she packed her car and set off for the lighthouse. The drive to the lighthouse was long and quiet, the winding road surrounded by trees that had grown tall and thick over the years. The lake came into view slowly, stretching out before her, its surface dark and uninviting. The fog was heavier now, as though the lake itself was holding its breath. When Eleanor arrived at the lighthouse, she was met with a sight that stirred a deep, unsettling feeling inside her. The lighthouse towered over the landscape, its white paint faded and peeling. The windows were boarded up, and the door creaked ominously when she tried to push it open. The once proud structure now seemed almost abandoned by time itself, as if nature had reclaimed it. But as Eleanor stood there, staring up at the lighthouse, a strange sense of familiarity washed over her. She had been here countless times as a child, visiting her grandfather. The lighthouse had always been a part of the landscape, looming in the distance like a silent sentinel. Now, however, it felt different, darker, more imposing. She could almost hear her grandfather's voice in her head, telling her to be careful, warning her about the things he had uncovered before his death. Her heart pounded as she walked through the door, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The air inside the lighthouse was heavy with dust and decay. It was quiet, unnervingly so. She moved cautiously through the rooms, shining her flashlight on the walls, where strange symbols and old maps adorned the surfaces. It was clear that this place hadn't seen a visitor in years, and yet there was an odd feeling of presence, as if someone or something was watching her. The stairway leading to the top of the lighthouse was narrow and steep, and with each step she took, she felt the weight of her grandfather's legacy pressing on her. She reached the top of the tower, where the light had once shone bright. It was now cold and lifeless, but on the floor, covered by a dusty cloth, she spotted an old wooden chest. With trembling hands, Eleanor opened it. Inside, there was a tattered journal, the edges worn from years of use. The journal was her grandfather's, and as she flipped through its pages, she began to uncover the truth about his final days. The entries were cryptic at first, describing his research into the lighthouse, but one page stopped her dead in her tracks. The light is not just a beacon. It is a key, a door, to something ancient and powerful. I have unlocked it, and now, I fear, it will not let me go. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The fear and desperation in her grandfather's words were unmistakable. It seemed that he had discovered something about the lighthouse, something that had driven him to the brink of madness. But what had he found? And why had he been so determined to uncover its secrets? As Eleanor sat in the dim light of the tower, reading her grandfather's journal, the storm outside grew fiercer. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the rain beat against the walls like an unrelenting drum. Eleanor felt the tension building in the air, a sense of unease that made her skin crawl. She could feel the weight of her grandfather's final discovery hanging over her. She had come here to uncover the truth, but now, she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. Her fingers brushed over the final entry in the journal. I have found the artifact. It is not of this world. It has power, and it must not be released. But I fear it already has. The light is the key to unlocking it, but it will also be the door to our doom. The artifact. Eleanor's heart raced. She remembered her grandfather mentioning something about an ancient object that held great power, something that could change everything. The artifact was here, somewhere in the lighthouse, and it was the key to understanding what had happened to Elias Thorne and why her grandfather had been so consumed by the lighthouse. As the storm raged outside, Eleanor's thoughts turned to the possibility of what might happen if she found the artifact. Her grandfather had been certain that it needed to remain hidden. But was she strong enough to stop whatever it was from being unleashed? Was it already too late? Her hand trembled as she searched the room, moving aside broken furniture and debris. Finally, she found it, a small, carved box hidden beneath the floorboards. It was old, its surface worn from years of disuse, but when she lifted it, a faint glow pulsed from within. Eleanor stared at the artifact, feeling a strange connection to it. It seemed to hum with a life of its own, as if it were calling to her. Her grandfather had warned her, but now there was no turning back. She had found it, and the truth, no matter how dangerous, was within her grasp. With trembling hands, she placed the artifact in the slot on the wall, just as her grandfather's journal had described. The lighthouse shook violently, and the air around her seemed to vibrate with power. The beam of light flickered to life, weak at first, then blindingly bright. It cut through the storm like a sword, illuminating the lake below. For a moment, everything stood still. The fog parted, and the waves of the lake began to churn as if something beneath the surface was stirring. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. Something was coming. Something had been waiting for this moment. The growl came from the water, deep and guttural, echoing in the silence. Eleanor's heart raced. She had unleashed it. The lighthouse light pulsed in time with the growing storm, the creature beneath the waves now fully awake. The wind howled as the lighthouse began to tremble violently, and the floor beneath her feet cracked. Suddenly, Eleanor heard a voice, calling out through the wind. It was Gus, the old fisherman who had lived by the lake for as long as anyone could remember. He had always warned her about the lighthouse, and now, it seemed, his warning had come true. "You've done it, haven't you?" Gus's voice was full of dread as he stepped into the tower. "You've opened the door. I didn't know what it would do, Eleanor said, her voice shaking. I didn't know what he uncovered, what my grandfather. You've unleashed something ancient, Gus replied. It's not just a story. The creature beneath the lake. It was locked away for a reason. The storm reached its peak, the waves crashing violently against the shore, and the lighthouse began to tremble as the light shone brighter than ever. Eleanor and Gus knew they had only one choice. To stop the creature from escaping, they had to extinguish the light once again. But could they? Could she? Eleanor stood at the top of the lighthouse, the artifact pulsing in her hands, its energy almost overwhelming. Her grandfather had unlocked the light, but now it was up to her to extinguish it again. The storm outside seemed to echo her uncertainty. With a steadying breath, Eleanor placed the artifact back into the wall, and the light began to dim. The storm subsided, the waves calmed, and the creature's growl faded away. Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was fleeting. The lighthouse was safe, for now, but she knew that she had only delayed the inevitable. The artifact, the light, and the creature beneath the lake were all part of something far older and far more powerful than anything she had ever imagined. Years later, Eleanor sat in her living room, the fire crackling in the hearth. The storm had passed, and the lake had returned to its quiet, still nature. The lighthouse still stood, its light dark and lifeless. But the legacy of the light would always remain with her. Her grandchildren visited, and she shared the stories of her grandfather, of the lighthouse, the light, and the artifact. She warned them, as Gus had once warned her, that some mysteries were best left unsolved. But she knew that, one day, the truth would call to them, just as it had called to her. And when that day came, they would be ready. The last light of dawn would always be theirs to protect. Months passed after the night Eleanor had unlocked the power of the lighthouse. Though she tried to convince herself that the storm had merely been a natural phenomenon and the creature beneath the lake just a figment of her grandfather's imagination, a deep part of her knew better. The night she reawakened the light, she hadn't simply reignited a long-dead lantern. She had opened a door. The world around her felt different now, more uncertain, more charged with the lingering presence of something old, something that had always been there, waiting. The lake, once calm and comforting, had taken on a new meaning. It now seemed alive in a way she had never noticed before. The mornings felt quieter, the sun didn't seem to shine as brightly, and the air carried a lingering sense of foreboding. Eleanor couldn't ignore the feeling that the light she had reignited was connected to something far more profound than just a lighthouse. It was as if she had disturbed the natural order of things, and that realization gnawed at her daily. But she wasn't the only one who sensed the unease. Gus, the fisherman who had once warned her about the dangers of the lighthouse, had become more reclusive in the months following the storm. His once cheerful greetings had turned to solemn nods. He had avoided the lake, something that never happened in all the years Eleanor had known him. It wasn't just the storm. There was something about the light returning that unnerved him. Gus knew something, and Eleanor had the sinking feeling that the answers he held might not be ones she wanted to hear. One cold morning, Eleanor went down to the docks, hoping to find Gus. The lake was still, as it always was in the early hours of the day, and the mist curled gently above the water. She found him sitting in a small boat, rocking gently on the water, staring out over the lake. "You've been avoiding me," Eleanor said softly, stepping onto the dock. Gus didn't look at her, but his voice was tinged with something Eleanor hadn't heard before, fear. "I'm not avoiding you, Eleanor. I just don't have anything left to say. Don't lie to me. I know there's more you aren't telling me. I've been to the lighthouse. I've seen what my grandfather left behind. And I've seen the light. It's alive. There's something in the water. What is it, Gus?" He sighed heavily and turned his weathered eyes toward her. "You think you understand what you've done, but you don't. What your grandfather found, what you reawakened. There's no going back. The light holds something ancient, something the people of this town have kept secret for centuries. They've kept the lake and the lighthouse locked away for a reason. And that reason? It's not to guide ships to safety. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She stepped closer to the boat, leaning over the edge. What is it? What was Elias Thorne trying to protect? What's beneath the lake? Gus swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he gripped the sides of the boat. He took a deep breath before speaking again. It's not a what, Eleanor. It's a who. At least it was. Long ago, before the lighthouse was built, the lake wasn't just a body of water. It was a sacred site, a place of great power. And something dark was sealed beneath it. The light, the beacon, it wasn't just to guide sailors. It was to keep something trapped down below. Something that feeds off light. That light you've reignited? It's letting it out again. Eleanor's chest tightened, and her voice came out in a whisper. What do you mean it feeds off light? The creature that was sealed beneath the lake. It was never meant to be freed. The people who built that lighthouse knew exactly what they were doing. They created the light to keep it contained. And once that light is gone, once it's awakened, it can never be put back again. It feeds off the energy, and it grows stronger every time the light shines. The more it feeds, the more it breaks free of its prison. Gus paused, looking at Eleanor with eyes full of sorrow. Your grandfather, he didn't just discover the artifact. He found the truth. The creature is the reason Elias Thorne went mad. It can't be controlled. It was locked away for a reason. And now that you've opened the door, it's too late. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud over Eleanor's mind. The creature beneath the lake. Her grandfather had uncovered it, and now she had unleashed it. She felt the weight of her actions more than ever. And yet, there was no undoing what had been done. The stormy night that had followed the light's reawakening was only the beginning. Since then, there had been strange occurrences on the lake. Fishermen reported seeing strange shadows moving beneath the surface, ripples spreading out from points where no boat had passed. There were whispers of eerie sounds echoing through the fog, like the mournful cry of a creature from the depths. Eleanor knew that it wasn't just the lake playing tricks, it was the creature, growing stronger with each passing day. And now, the creature had begun to manifest itself. It started with the lake. On quiet mornings, when the fog was thickest and the air was still, the surface of the water seemed to tremble, as if something was stirring just beneath. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the depths. The creature was awake, and it was growing restless. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and the fog began to roll in, Eleanor went down to the dock to watch the water. The lake had always been a part of her life, but now it felt alien to her, as if it had become a different world altogether, a world that was no longer hers to navigate. As she stood on the dock, the temperature seemed to drop. A thick mist surrounded her, obscuring her vision of the water. It was then that she heard it, soft at first, then growing louder, a low, guttural sound, like the deep rumble of something powerful rising from below. Eleanor froze in place, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. Suddenly, the surface of the water broke open, as though something massive was pushing its way to the surface. Eleanor stepped back, her heart racing in her chest. She saw it then, just for a moment, a massive shadow beneath the mist. It moved with unsettling speed, its form so large and dark that it seemed to swallow the light from the sky. Before she could react, the shadow disappeared into the depths once more. The water calmed almost instantly, but the feeling of dread lingered in the air. Eleanor stood at the edge of the dock, trembling, unsure of what she had just witnessed. It was real. The creature beneath the lake was real, and it was no longer confined to the depths. It was reaching for the surface, growing stronger by the day. Eleanor knew she couldn't keep running from the truth. The creature was alive, and it was no longer just a story or a mystery. It was a threat. The light was the key to keeping it contained, And if it wasn't extinguished, if it wasn't put back where it belonged, the creature would escape completely. Her mind raced. She had to stop the creature, but how? How could she undo the damage she had done? How could she return the light to its dormant state, to where it belonged? Gus's words haunted her. It can't be controlled. But Eleanor refused to accept that. She had already come this far. She had to finish what her grandfather started, and she would find a way to put the creature back to sleep, no matter the cost. Eleanor made her way back to the lighthouse, determined to face whatever waited for her there. She couldn't do it alone, though. She needed help. There was one person she could turn to, Gus. The man who had warned her. The man who knew the lake better than anyone. The storm had not yet subsided when Eleanor reached the lighthouse once again, its towering silhouette looming ominously in the fog. Each step she took toward it felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the truth she had uncovered and the daunting task ahead. Gus had warned her, and she could see the deep concern etched into his weathered face when she spoke with him earlier. The creature beneath the lake was no myth. It was real, and it was waking up. Inside the lighthouse, Eleanor felt an eerie stillness in the air, as though the building itself was holding its breath. The light that had once illuminated the shores of Lake Barlow now sat dormant, and the artifact she had placed back into the wall seemed to pulse faintly in response to her presence. She could feel its power, and she knew in her bones that she was about to face something that not only challenged her knowledge of the natural world, but also her understanding of what was possible. Gus had accompanied her, but his expression was grim. He had lived by the lake all his life and knew more than most about its mysteries. Yet the look in his eyes spoke of something deeper, a fear that stretched back decades to a time when the lake was a place of reverence, of worship, and of secrets that had been buried for far too long. The light, Gus said quietly as he stood by the window, staring out over the lake. It wasn't just there to guide sailors. It was built to hold something back. I know, Eleanor said, her voice hoarse. My grandfather wrote about it. But the light, it's the only thing that can keep the creature trapped, isn't it? Gus nodded, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the artifact that lay in the middle of the room. The light feeds it, and once it's lit, once it's shining, the creature grows stronger. But once it goes out, it weakens again, retreats back to where it came from. But it won't stay down forever. Eleanor looked at the artifact in her hand, the small box now pulsing steadily. The feeling of power radiated from it, and she could feel it vibrating in her fingertips. She had to make a decision, and fast. The creature was close, too close. She could feel it in her bones. We have to stop it before it gets too strong, she whispered, her gaze hardening with resolve. You're right, but it's not just about extinguishing the light. The light is the key, but it's also a warning, a sacrifice. Gus's voice softened. The artifact is tied to the light, but the light can't exist without it. You can't just turn it off, Eleanor. You have to understand what it means to extinguish it completely. Once the light goes out for good, the lake won't be the same. The creature will retreat, but it might come back. A cold chill swept over Eleanor. She had no time to second-guess herself. The storm outside raged, and the water churned like a living thing. The air in the lighthouse seemed to thrum with energy, and her heartbeat quickened. The lake was not only a place of power, but a place of danger. She had to stop this cycle. She had to close the door her grandfather had unwittingly opened. But how? As night fell over Lake Barlow, Eleanor stood before the great lantern in the center of the lighthouse. The light was still off, and the shadowy remnants of the storm outside filtered through the cracked windows. She felt the weight of history pressing on her. Her grandfather's legacy, the townspeople's whispered fears, and the knowledge that the lake was hiding something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Gus stood beside her, silent and watchful. The air between them felt thick with tension, as if the very walls of the lighthouse were holding their breath. Eleanor had no choice but to go forward. The creature beneath the lake wasn't a mere myth or story. It was real. And the light that had been used to protect the town and keep the creature at bay, was the only thing powerful enough to send it back into the darkness where it belonged. Eleanor reached out and placed the artifact into the slot in the wall once again, her fingers brushing the cold surface of the stone. As soon as she did, the lighthouse seemed to shudder in response. The floor beneath her feet trembled slightly, and she felt an electric jolt in the air. The artifact was reacting to the light once more, and it seemed to hum, like a living being calling out to its master. "Are you ready for this?" Gus's voice broke through the silence, his words filled with an unsettling mix of hope and resignation. Eleanor nodded, her face set in determination. "I have no choice. I have to stop it." She pushed the artifact into place, and a bright light burst from the lantern above them, flooding the room with a harsh, unearthly glow. The beam stretched far across the lake, illuminating the mist-covered water below. The light pulsed, and the power behind it was undeniable. Eleanor could feel the creature stirring beneath the surface, like a predator sensing its prey. The light flickered, its intensity growing, and then it stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor's pulse raced as she watched the lighthouse's beam go dark. She could feel the shift in the air, the change in the energy surrounding her. It was over. The creature was once again locked beneath the lake. The door had closed, but the silence that followed was eerie, oppressive. Eleanor looked out across the lake, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had done. She had succeeded. The light had gone out, and the creature was sealed away once more. But at what cost? The lighthouse fell silent, and the storm outside gradually began to die down. The winds calmed, and the fog began to recede from the surface of the lake. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was peace. Eleanor stood at the window, staring out across the water as the last remnants of the storm dissipated. Gus stood behind her, his hand resting on the railing. "You did it," he said quietly. "You stopped it." Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She could feel the quiet around her, the calm that had settled into the air. But beneath it, she could sense the heaviness of the lake. The creature was still there, waiting. And as much as she wanted to believe it was truly over, a part of her knew the truth. The creature was merely lying dormant, waiting for its next chance. "Is it really over?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Is it gone for good?" Gus looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. "The lake has its own way of keeping secrets, Eleanor. The creature is sealed, but nothing is ever truly gone. It might come back, but it's up to you now. You've stopped it for today. What happens tomorrow? That's up to you." Eleanor closed her eyes, the weight of his words settling on her. She had thought the light's extinction would be the end of it, but she realized then that it was only a temporary solution. The lake, the light, and the creature beneath it were all intertwined, connected by forces far beyond her understanding. "Then I'll keep watch," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "I'll make sure the light stays dark. I'll protect the secret, just as my grandfather did." Gus gave her a soft nod, his eyes filled with understanding. "You've got the strength of your grandfather in you, Eleanor. He would be proud." Eleanor glanced once more at the still water outside. The peace was a facade, a fragile calm before the storm. But for now, it was enough. She had completed her grandfather's mission. And though the future was uncertain, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. She would never stop watching the lake. She would never stop protecting the secrets it held. Years passed, and the lighthouse remained dormant, its light extinguished for good. Eleanor, now older but still strong, continued to live by the shores of Lake Barlow. The town had slowly moved on, the mystery of the lighthouse fading into legend. But Eleanor knew better. She knew that the creature beneath the lake had not gone forever. It was simply waiting, just as it always had. From the tower of the lighthouse, Eleanor would watch the lake. The creature would not return unless the light was reignited, and she would not let that happen. She was the keeper now, just as her grandfather had been before her, and she would protect the secrets of the lake until the end of her days. As the years passed, the lighthouse became a forgotten relic, its darkened light standing like a monument to the past. The townspeople no longer feared it, but Eleanor knew better. The lake would never be truly safe. It was just a matter of time before the creature would stir once more. But for now, Eleanor stood at the window, watching the peaceful lake, knowing that she had done her part. She was the last light of dawn. The years passed more quietly than Eleanor had expected. The town of Lake Barlow continued its slow, peaceful rhythm, its people unaware of the dangers lurking beneath their feet. The lighthouse, once a symbol of guidance, now stood as a silent sentinel over the lake, its beacon extinguished. Eleanor had made sure it stayed that way, her vigilance never faltering. The creature beneath the lake was sealed, and the artifact, the key to everything, was hidden away, its power dormant for now. But Eleanor knew better than to let her guard down. She had seen too much. She had learned too much. The creature, the lake, and the light were bound together. And as long as the lake still existed, the story wasn't over. It never would be. Eleanor's days were spent in quiet solitude. She kept to herself mostly, tending to the lighthouse and the land around it. The town had long forgotten the mysteries of the lake, and that was just how she preferred it. There were no more visitors, no more questions. The lighthouse was left to decay, and so too was the legend. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor found herself standing at the edge of the dock, gazing out at the lake. The mist had rolled in early, wrapping the landscape in an eerie silence. The wind had picked up, and the air felt heavy with an unknown weight. She had grown accustomed to the stillness of the lake, but tonight, something felt different. The air felt thick, as though something were pressing against her, pushing the boundaries of the quiet world she had created for herself. Eleanor had heard the stories of the lake's power for years, but it wasn't until this moment that she truly understood. She had been watching, protecting, waiting for something to happen, but it was clear now the lake was not something that could ever be fully controlled. It had a life of its own, a force greater than her, and it would never truly rest. For a long moment, Eleanor stood there, letting the mist surround her. Her mind drifted back to the first time she'd visited the lighthouse with her grandfather. She remembered the stories he had told her, the way he had spoken of the lake's power as if it were something to be feared but also something to be respected. It was a part of them, a part of everything. Her grandfather had always told her that some secrets were meant to be left alone. Maybe he had known, even then, that the lake's power could never be fully understood. But Eleanor, in her stubbornness, had tried to solve the puzzle. And now, as the mist curled around her like a forgotten memory, she realized that the true answer had always been beyond her reach. The next few days were quiet. The storm that had stirred in the distance grew larger, but it never reached Lake Barlow. It hung over the horizon like a shadow, darkening the skies, but leaving the lake untouched. But Eleanor could feel the storm in the air, as if it were pulling at the very fabric of the world. The peace she had worked so hard to preserve was beginning to feel fragile, as though the storm was drawing closer, both from the outside and from within herself. One night, as Eleanor sat by the fire in the lighthouse, an unexpected visitor arrived. It was a young man, probably no older than her grandson would have been if she had had one. He was a historian, a researcher from the nearby university, and he had come to ask about the lighthouse. His voice was polite but persistent, and his eyes were filled with curiosity. It wasn't the first time someone had come asking about the lighthouse, but there was something different about him. He had that look in his eye, the same look her grandfather had carried when he first began researching the lake. Ms. Westbrook, the young man began, I've been studying old records about this area, and I found references to strange occurrences in Lake Barlow. things that don't make sense. The town records mention the lighthouse, but they don't talk much about it. Do you know anything about why it was built? What the purpose of the light really was? Eleanor's stomach tightened. She had spent years keeping the secret, and now the questions were coming back. The light, the artifact, the creature beneath the lake. Everything she had tried to bury was surfacing once again. The lighthouse, Eleanor said slowly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her, was built to guide ships. But it was also built to keep something buried, something best left forgotten. The young man looked at her, intrigued but not fully understanding. But the town seems to have forgotten about it. The light hasn't been on in years. What happened? Eleanor hesitated. How much should she tell him? How much of the truth could she share before it was too late? She was getting older, and she knew that eventually someone would come seeking the answers. But she wasn't ready for it to be this young man. Not yet. Not when the storm was so close. I don't think you understand, Eleanor said quietly. There are things beneath that lake that we can't control. The light was never just for ships. It was a prison, and the artifact that you're looking for? It's the key to something ancient, something powerful, something that should never be freed. The young man frowned, confused. But I don't understand. What's so dangerous about the light? Isn't it just a symbol? A guiding beacon for ships? Eleanor stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. Not everything in this world is what it seems. Not everything is meant to be understood. The storm outside had grown stronger, and the wind began to howl. The lighthouse creaked and groaned as if responding to her words. She looked at the young man, her gaze steady. I've spent my life protecting this town from what's hidden beneath the surface. But now, the lake is calling again. It always will. And eventually, someone will come looking for the truth. Maybe it will be you, but be careful. The answers you seek might not be the ones you want. The young man nodded, his expression uncertain. He didn't understand, but he was determined to. Eleanor could see it in his eyes. He wasn't going to let it go. He would keep asking questions, and eventually he would get too close to the truth. As he left the lighthouse that night, Eleanor felt a deep unease settle in her chest. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was brewing inside her. She had been the keeper of the light, the guardian of the lake, but the truth was slipping away from her grasp. The storm was coming again, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The next morning, Eleanor awoke to the sound of rain against the window, the rhythmic tapping almost soothing in its consistency. But the storm had not passed. It was still there, lurking just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to strike. She went outside to the lighthouse, standing at the top of the tower and looking out over the lake. The water was still calm, as it had been for years. The fog rolled gently over the surface, the lake shrouded in the same mist that had always surrounded it. Eleanor felt the weight of her years pressing down on her. The lake had always been there, and she had always been its guardian. But now, as she stood on the edge of the lighthouse, looking out over the water, she wondered how long she could keep the peace. How long could she keep the creature beneath the surface sealed away? The answers weren't easy, and they never had been. But as the mist swirled around her, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. She had done her part. The light had gone out, and the creature had been sealed away, at least for now. The rest was up to time, and to those who would come after her. And so, as she stood there, the lighthouse behind her and the lake in front of her, Eleanor made her peace. She would not be here forever, but the lake and the secrets it held would remain, waiting for the next keeper, waiting for the next storm. The legacy of the lighthouse, the light, and the creature beneath the water would live on. Eleanor Westbrook had watched over them all, and she would do so until the very end.